most of the evidence of systemic racism boils down to the mere pointing to disparities as prima facie evidence for racism, and that's just a fallacy. In each of these cases, there are usually always facts that undermine this narrative.
You said your grandparents were more optimistic about the future than a lot of younger Black people seem to be today, even though they grew up during Jim Crow. Some of those younger people might reply, well, yeah, but maybe if you had asked them, if you had said to them in the 1950s, hey, the civil rights bill is going to pass, and described all the the things, Jim Crow is going to end and so on, and eventually even subtle housing discrimination will be against the law and so on. I'm these young Black people who disagree with you might say your grandparents probably would have imagined that by now things would be better for the average Black person in America. And so their challenge to you might be, well, what are we supposed to do? We think wokeism will do it. You obviously disagree, but what do you say to that?
I hesitate to speak on behalf of anyone else, but knowing what my grandfather says about current society, the truth is the precise opposite. If you had asked, just think about this. If you asked any Black person in 2006 whether we could elect a Black president, most would have said no, right? Which is to say they had too pessimistic a view just within a 2 or 3 year window of the country. If you would ask Black people in the 1950s and the 1960s how far they thought we'd have gotten by now, none would have said we could have had a Black president, for example. None would have even said we could have had a Black vice president. And, a couple weeks ago, or a couple months ago, actually, my grandfather came up to visit me in New York and saw me perform at a music club where I play. And I had a friend there who was a white woman. And he commented that he saw me just very in a relaxed manner having this friendship with a white woman, right? And he commented to me of how shocking it was, because just to think of the difference of him in the 1950s and 60s crossing the color line, as they would have called it then, to have a friendship, much, to say nothing of a flirtation with a white woman, compared to now that the fact that I wouldn't even think about it, that was amazing to him. So grafting that attitude, I have to think his attitude would be the opposite. It would be, we've come much further than I even could have imagined.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd like to, I want to talk about the music a little, the hip hop. First, I want to ask one more question along these lines, which is like, probably after this airs, somebody who disagrees with you will say you should have asked him this. And I don't yet know what that will be. But do you have an idea of, like, if Ibram X. Kendi were sitting next to me, or Nicole Hannah-Jones or somebody, and I take it you would say, yes, you disagree with both of them about a lot of stuff. Like, what would they say? Well, do you have an idea of, like, they'd say, ask Coleman this. This'll give him trouble.
So they would say, look, you're pointing to Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, your ability to have a white friend as an indicator of progress. What about the 10-to-1 Black-white wealth gap? What about George Floyd? What about, all of the evidence of systemic bias in every system, from healthcare, where we have maternal mortality disparities, to criminal justice system, and all the rest. I mean, this is, they would say, evidence that the nation is profoundly racist, that some would even go so far as to say the subtler kinds of racism that we have now are just as bad or maybe in some ways worse than the overt racism that we had in the past. And so the things you're adducing as evidence of progress are superficial compared to the mountain of evidence that racism pervades society. That's probably something like what they would say.
And what would your answer be?
So the problem is, the accusation, it's sort of like, well, what is that law that it takes more work to refute bullshit than it does to create it? Not to say that all of these things are bullshit, but the, you know, most of the evidence of systemic racism boils down to the mere pointing to disparities as prima facie evidence for racism, and that's just a fallacy. There are, in each of these cases, there are usually always facts that undermine this narrative. So, for example, the more maternal mortality problem, where you have Black women of every socioeconomic background more likely to die in childbirth when compared to white women. This obviously, every woman that dies in childbirth is a absolute tragedy. It's like it's heart wrenching to even think of a single example, much less multiply them and think about all of the victims of this in the aggregate. But when you do that, you also see that Hispanic women, for some reason, fare better than even white women, and the explanations for these things are multivariate. They could have to do with everything from just fluke. Uh, you know, there's literally 100 different potential causes of this, and racial discrimination on the part of doctors, whether it's that they're not seeing that their Black patients are in pain, something like that. I mean, that's one of 100 variables it could be. And when you look at the broader landscape of disparities, uh, it becomes less and less plausible that racism is the driving force behind really any of these. It's like, okay, you look at one disease that Black people are dying more of than white people, right? And you say, oh, well, that's got to be racism. That's systemic racism right there. But then I can give you 10 diseases where white people are dying from them more than Black people, right? And I've looked at the CDC numbers and all this stuff, and then people have no explanation. It's like, the truth, and this is Sowell's, the point of half of Sowell's books at least, is that
Thomas Sowell.
Disparity is the norm on every metric you could possibly measure between every group and between different ethnicities of one particular race. Huge disparities quite often. And discrimination is one potential cause of those, and sometimes, no doubt, is the cause. But I find it very, I mean, I tend to think that, 90+% of the cause of most disparities has to do with factors that are not racism. Of course, it depends on each conversation should be had on its own.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my basic criticism.
And on the wealth gap, which is significant, and even the income gap, would you say, I mean, you don't purport to have a miracle cure, I guess, but you might say that actually some of the policies they favor, in some subtle sense, even get in the way of progress? Is that the idea?
Some of them would. I mean, certainly defund the police is horrible for high crime neighborhoods. It is if you're going to ask why this place is a food desert, or why all the stores here need bulletproof glass, getting rid of the police is not going to solve that problem. Getting rid of the police is not going to lead to businesses and investment flooding into this neighborhood, creating local jobs and so forth. So that's an example, certainly, of a counterproductive policy.